Little Johnny and his grandpa were out in the front lawn after a rainstorm, and little Johnny saw this nightcrawler that was trying to get back into its hole. He said, "Grandpa, I bet you $5 I could get this worm back into this hole here." He says, "No, you can't. It's way too wiggly and too limp for you to get it back in that hole." Little Johnny says, "Do you want to place the bet?" His grandpa says, "You're on." So little Johnny runs in the house and grabs a can of hairspray and sprays that worm all over until the thing dies and is super stiff, and he pushes it right into the hole. So his grandpa pays him the $5, grabs a can of hairspray, and runs into the house. About 30 minutes later, he comes back out, and he says, "Here you go, little Johnny, here's $5. He says, "Grandpa, but you already paid me." He smiles and says, "Yes, that $5 is from your grandma." Teacher says, "All right, kids, turn in your homework." Little Johnny says, "Sorry, Teach, I don't have mine." She says, "Johnny, you had all weekend to do your homework. What happened?" He said, "My dog is in the hospital." She goes, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" He said, "Well, he ran out in the middle of the street, car came up and hit him right in the ass." She says, "Little Johnny, you mean wrecked him?" He says, "No, Teach, not wrecked him. It damn near killed him." Little Johnny and little Susie had been married for about 15 years, and one day she stepped out of the shower, stands in front of the mirror, and she says, "Little Johnny, my breasts are too small." He says, "Well, if you want them to grow, you got to take some toilet paper and rub in between your breasts." So she grabs some toilet paper and she starts rubbing in between them, and she says, "Well, how long is this going to take?" He said, "Well, it'll happen gradually over the years. They'll definitely grow." And she stops and she says, "How do you know that my breasts are going to get larger by rubbing toilet paper over them gradually over the years?" He said, "Well, it worked for your butt, didn't it?" Little Johnny's in sex education class, and the teacher's reading out of a book. Well, in this book, there's a couple of theories as to why the man's head of his penis is larger than the shaft. Well, one of these theories suggests that the reason why is for the pleasure of the man, and another one of the theories suggests it's for the pleasure of the woman. Well, little Johnny raises his hand and he says, "Ma'am, I have my own theory as to why the man's head of his penis is larger than the shaft." And the teacher says, "Okay, little Johnny, go ahead. What's your theory?" He says, "And I think all of the guys in here can attest to this. And I think the reason why the head is bigger than the shaft is so that he doesn't punch him himself in the face when he's making that fist." In history class, the teacher asked, "When was the two-piece bathing suit invented?" Little Susie raises her hand and she says, 1946. Teacher says, "That's great, little Susie. And why was the two-piece bathing suit invented?" Nobody raised their hand, and little Johnny's asleep in the class. And she said, "Little Johnny, why was the two-piece bathing suit invented?" "To separate the hairy from the dairy." Teacher says, "Okay, class, I want you to tell me what you did over the weekend." Little Susie raises her hand and she says, "Well, me and my mom baked a bunch of cakes for the bake sale at church." Teacher says, "Oh, that's great, little Susie." Little Timmy raises his hand and he says, "Well, me and my dad, we built a tree fort in our backyard all weekend long." She says, "Oh, that's really nice, little Timmy." "Well, little Johnny, what did you do over the weekend?" He says, "I got into a fight." She says, "A fight?" He says, "Yeah, it was with my boner, but don't worry, I beat it single-handedly." Teacher said, "Little Johnny, scientists have discovered that there are two things in the air that make women pregnant. Do you know what those two things are?" "Could you repeat the question, please?" "Little Johnny, pay attention. I said scientists have discovered that there are two things in the air that make women pregnant. What are they?" "I don't know. Their legs?" Little Johnny's family lived out on a farm, and they had gotten a bull to breed the cows. So one day, little Johnny runs in the house and goes, "Mama, Mama, the bull's fucking one of the cows." His mom says, "Little Johnny, we don't talk that way." She says, "The next time you see that, you say that the bull is surprising the cow." Little Johnny doesn't think anything of it, and he says, "Okay." A couple days later, little Johnny comes in the house, and he says, "Mama, Mama, the bull is surprising all the cows." Mom says, "No, that's impossible. He can't be surprising all of the cows." Little Johnny says, "Oh, but it is, it is." She goes, "Well, how do you know?" He says, "Because it's fucking the horse." Little Johnny's sitting at the kitchen table and he's doing his math homework. He says, 2 plus 3 and the son of a bitch is 5. 4 plus 4 and the son of a bitch is 8. His mom comes over and says, little Johnny, where'd you learn to talk like that? He says, my teacher. That's how he taught us how to do these. She says, oh, no. Tomorrow, I'm going to go and talk to him. Little Johnny says, okay. And next day, little Johnny's mom goes to the math teacher and she says, now this is how my son was doing his math homework. 2 plus 3 and the son of a bitch is 5. Now, where did he learn how to do that? The math teacher just laughs and he says, ma'am, 2 plus 3 and the sum of which is 5. So little Johnny goes to his first Packer game and he gets some nosebleed seats. And he's looking down there at the field and he notices that there's this guy in the 50-yard line that has seats 5 rows up, and he's sitting there by himself with an empty seat next to him. So little Johnny watches him the whole first half. After halftime comes up, little Johnny goes down there and he says, hey man, I noticed that you've got the best seats in the house and you've got an empty seat next to you. He says, yeah, that's my wife's seat. We've been coming for the last 20 years. He says, well, why isn't she here? He says, well, she passed away. He says, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He says, but couldn't you find anybody to fill that seat? He says, yeah, I tried. I talked to everybody. He says, but they all wanted to go to the funeral. Little Johnny and his buddy Jimmy both work at the same factory, and they both ended up getting laid off. So they went down to the unemployment office and go on in, and the lady says to little Johnny, well, what is it that you do for a living? He says, I'm a panty stitcher. So she looks up panty stitcher, and it's unskilled labor. And she says, I'm going to pay you $120 a week. And he says, okay, and he leaves, and Jimmy goes in. She says, well, what do you do for a living? He says, I'm a diesel fitter. She looks up diesel fitter, and diesel fitter is $200 a week. It's skilled labor. So Jimmy goes out and tells little Johnny, and little Johnny is livid. He goes on in, and he says, lady, why'd you pay me $120 and pay him $200? She says, well, because a panty stitcher is unskilled labor. He says, what do you mean it's unskilled labor? He says, I sew all the elastic into the panties and thongs, and all he does is put them over his head and say, diesel fitter. One time, little Johnny was stuck out on a desert island with nothing but a pig and a Doberman pinscher. After a couple of months of being out there, that pig started to look pretty good to little Johnny with that nice pink flesh and the round butt. But every time that little Johnny tried to make an advance at the pig, the Doberman would snarl at him and try and bite him. Well, one day, little Johnny was looking off from the horizon and he saw this dinghy out there. So he swims out to the dinghy, and at the bottom of it was this beautiful woman that's unconscious. So Johnny brings her back, brings her to the hut, and he, gets her healthy. And she says, oh my gosh, thank you for saving my life. Is there anything that I can do to help you, to repay you? And he says, yeah. You mind taking the dog for a walk? Little Johnny goes over by his grandma at a family barbecue, and she's just sitting there smiling. Little Johnny says, well, what are you smiling about? She said, oh, nothing. It's just that everybody that's here got here because I got laid. Little Johnny says, yeah, well, the joke's on you. Because the next time that you get laid, it's going to be in the ground. Oh, man, Hey, John, I ever tell you the story about when I lived with my abusive aunt and uncle?
Nope.
Well, we lived out on this farm with no animals. There's fields but no animals. And one day my uncle comes home with this filthy-ass horse. My aunt sees it and says, oh, it's so nice. And she wanted to name it Dirty. And they knew that I like to ride horses too. They said to me, if we ever catch you riding that horse, we're going to beat your ass. And they do it because they've done it before. So one day I'm out in the field and playing with this tractor tire, and Dirty's next to me just eating grass and shit. And they kept looking outside, looking at me. And a couple minutes later, I decided to get in the tractor tire, and it just starts rolling down the hill. And my aunt and uncle, they come outside, and they see me rolling. They hating, patrolling, trying to catch me riding dirty. One day, little Johnny's playing with his toy cars on the living room floor. The pastor comes over and sits on the couch and is talking to little Johnny's dad. And little Johnny smashes one of his fingers with the car and says, oh, shit. Well, Dad picks him up and brings him into his room and makes him sit in there for a half hour. Well, Johnny comes out and he sits on the couch next to the pastor, his head down, and the pastor says, little Johnny, hearing those words come out of your mouth sent shivers up and down my spine. Little Johnny looks up at him and smiles. He says, "Oh, yeah? Well, if you would have been here yesterday when my dad hit his finger with the hammer, you'd have froze to death."